Hi, and welcome to my presentation titled Introduction to the Jamf Binary and Jamf Commands. My name is Lee Cassiopo, and I'm a professional services engineer at Jamf. Prior to joining Jamf, I also spent the previous 10 years in K-12, higher education, and the government sectors. Today, I'll be going over some background information about the Jamf binary, giving some examples of functionality built into the Jamf binary by explaining some of the verbs that can be used, and also giving examples of how the Jamf binary may fit into your existing or new workflows. So, first, in regards to the background information, we're going to talk about where the Jamf binary is located. This can be shown by typing the command in, shown in orange on this slide, which Jamf. Many of my slides will contain text in orange, and that'll be showing you the commands you can write to yield the results seen on the screen. So when we run that command, we get back user local bin jamf. Now, this is an alias, but the reason I wanted to point this out is because user local bin is in our default search path. That's what allows us to just use the word jamf to call commands instead of specifying the full path, user local bin jamf, or user local jamf bin jamf. But it is a good practice to be in to specify the full path to the binary. So we'll take a look at the Finder windows. So here is Finder showing the path to user local bin jamf. You'll see the file path outlined in red. And we can see that Jamf here is seen as an alias. Like I said, it's pointing to user local jamf bin jamf. And here we can see the Jamf file defined as a Unix executable file. This is actually the binary. Here's where it gets installed upon enrollment of your computer into Jamf Pro. So we'll talk through some verbs that we have. The first one I'm going to go into is Jamf Help. Jamf Help is a kind of manual or man page for the Jamf binary. We get a list of verb options from it and descriptions of those and how they can be used. Also, you can get more information about individual verbs here by running Jamf Help and then the name of the verb that you want more information about. I'll be showing this feature a lot in my examples, as you'll see further in my slides. So, first, we'll take a look at Jamf Policy. Jamf Policy here is what is initiating a check-in with our Jamf Pro server to see if there's any policies in scope that would need to be run. This is also what's running every 15 minutes on your server if you haven't changed the default settings in terms of your global check-in. That 15-minute interval is your computer running Jamf Policy. We can see here on the help screen, we have a couple different flags that show us how we can use the policy verb, including -event, -username, and -id to call policies via an event trigger or their ID number. And we also have return codes. So if we have a policy failing for some reason, we could take a look at that return code and see if there's a reason that we can figure out why that policy may not be running as expected. To take a look at a few of the flags in particular, first we'll look at Jamf Policy with an ID flag. We can run Jamf Policy -ID and then the ID number of a policy to call a specific policy by its ID number. You'll see in my example, I'm calling the policy with ID number 1, which is our built-in update inventory policy that's built into our Jamf Pro server. Now you can do this with any policy in Jamf Pro. If you need to find out what the ID number is, you can always click in the URL of the page that has your policy and look for the part of the URL that says ID equals and then a number. That is going to be the ID number of that policy, and you can call it via this command. I will note, though, that this does respect restrictions such as scope and frequency. So a computer will still need to be in scope and allow it to be run at this trigger. If it's once per computer, you may need to flush the logs in order to see it actually reflect by running this command. We can also use the -event flag to call policies by a custom trigger. You'll see in the example I did Jamf Policy -event Firefox to call my install Firefox policy. This can be really helpful because you can create a naming mechanism for your custom event triggers so that you have an idea of what trigger will call what policy. For example, I have a Firefox policy. I'm calling it via a trigger called Firefox. So this can be helpful to use in place of ID numbers, as you may not always remember the ID off the top of your head. Finally, in policies, I'm going to talk through the verbose flag. You can use the verbose flag on the policy verb and also on many other verbs in the Jamf binary to get more information back from Jamf Pro while it's running. You'll see here all the lines that start with verbose, including lines like the management framework settings are up to date. That's because running Jamf policy will also make sure the framework settings are up to date and update them if they are not. Another verb we're going to talk about is recon. Recon is the means by which that we can submit inventory to our Jamf Pro server. As we talked about a little on the slide regarding Jamf Help, running Jamf Help recon shows us additional flags and information about running the recon verb. Like that we can specify inventory information, things like asset tag or username or building. We can also run with a -verbose flag to get more information back during that inventory submission. So to show an example of that, here I run sudo jamf recon -verbose to run a recon with verbose output. Once I authenticate here, you'll see the output start to scroll on the screen, and it actually puts back a whole lot of information. The apps it's finding, the extension attributes it's running, so you can kind of see what's going on in the background during your recon run. And we can also, like I said, specify information to update, like building, department, and asset tag. In my example, I run jamf recon -asset tag, and then tag 00123. This will take that tag number and put it into my computer's inventory record in the asset tag field for me. Another verb option we have is set computer name. Some people may choose to use their own scripts to set their computer's names, but I wanted to point out there's also an option built into the Jamf binary. We can use something like the -name flag to set a static device name. You'll see I run set computer name -name and then JNUC -demo. Once I run that command, we can see in system preferences that my computer name and the host name have both changed to JNUC demo. If we didn't want to set a static name and wanted to use something like the serial number, we have a -use serial number flag that we can use. So we have Jamf set computer name -use serial number, and it sets my computer name and the host name to be the serial number of my computer. And we can see that reflected in system preferences again. If we wanted more information besides that, we can also add prefixes or suffixes to our computer names. So in my example, I used a prefix of MBP- for MacBook Pro. But you could also do this with things like department or building. Any other type of information that you may want before or after, you can add with a prefix or suffix flag. So this still guarantees that all the names will be unique because they're based around an individual computer's serial number. As we come to expect, once running that, you can verify in system preferences that the computer name and host name have updated to MBP- and then my serial number. Another verb we'll talk about is display message. we can use this to show a message on our computers. Just a quick message, Jamf display message, dash message, and then what we want to display. In this case, hello world. It'll look something along the lines of this. So you'll see generic message with the generic icon, but it's great for those quick types of prompts. If we wanted something more advanced than that with different buttons and customization of logos and icons, we may look into something more like Jamf Helper, but just wanted to point out that the basics are built into the Jamf binary. We can also interact with the doc through the Jamf binary. We have the Jamf modify doc verb. We can see via the help page here that we can use things like the ID numbers of doc items that are currently in our Jamf Pro to add or remove those from the doc. We can choose whether or not we kill the doc process as part of this, and if we want the doc item to show up at the beginning. So, for an example, I added a doc item into my Jamf Pro for Composer. It's the first doc item I've created, so it has an ID number of 1. So when I call Jamf modify doc dash ID number 1, and then add a dash beginning flag to it, it's going to relaunch my doc and put the Composer icon next to Finder. So we can see in my demo, I have it running that command, and the doc will relaunch, and Composer will show up next to Finder. We can use this same modify doc verb, though, to also remove doc items. So I'm also going to have it remove based on its ID number, running Jamf modify doc dash ID, ID number of 1, but instead of beginning, I will use the dash remove flag. When I run that command, just as quickly as we saw it apply, we will have that Composer icon removed from the doc, and the doc process will relaunch. Some other helpful verbs we have are check JSS connection. I've used this before as a sanity check. If there's something that's not working quite as expected, maybe I check to see if I can currently reach my Jamf Pro server. That's where we can use the check JSS connection verb. We can also use a verb of flush policy history for troubleshooting. Now, you'll notice here, I put text in red on this slide, and that's because this flushes the entire policy history for a computer. So, while this can be helpful for things like troubleshooting, you do want to be aware of how many policies you might have that run once per computer that you may have just told to run again on your computers. So, great for troubleshooting, but just exercise precaution when running a verb like this. Like doc items, we can also interact with printers via the Jamf binary. So, via the help page, we can see that we can either map printers based off their ID number in Jamf Pro, if we already have added the printer to Jamf, or we can add more information like the cup's name, location, or driver information, and have it map a printer manually like that. Like my doc item example, I'm going to use a printer that I already have added to Jamf Pro. So I'm going to map it using its ID number. You'll see here, I can run Jamf map printer dash ID and then the ID number of it in Jamf Pro, and we will see the printer show up in system preferences mapped with the appropriate driver. Just like doc items, we can also remove printers. However, there isn't a dash remove flag. We actually have a separate verb for that for printers. We have a delete printer verb. So you can see on the Jamf Help delete printer that we have a lot less options here. The only flag we need to provide is the cup's name. So we can do a Jamf delete printer dash cup's name and then the name of the printer. In this case, my printer was named JNUC demo. If I run that command, we will see the printer delete from our computer just as quickly as it was put on. And there we see the printer disappear. The last verb I wanted to discuss today is Jamf Remove Framework. This removes the Jamf binary and associated files from the computer. Again, this has its purposes and can be used if you're doing things like repurposing a computer. But it's another verb that you want to exercise caution when running because you are removing the Jamf binary and associated files. Now, the list of verbs that I went over today is by no means an exhaustive list. There are plenty of verbs that I did not discuss in this presentation, and if you'd like to look more into those, I would suggest running Jamf Help and taking a look at the list. Like we said, you can also run Jamf Help and then the name of an additional verb that I may not have discussed to get more information on the flags and usage of that verb in particular. But the one last thing that I did want to go over in my presentation today is a few usages, workflows that we can use the Jamf binary in. The first one of those is for troubleshooting. We talked about the usages of verbosity and using a -verbose flag and things like recon. If we notice that our inventory submissions are taking a while, we may run a Jamf recon with a verbose flag. See where it's getting stuck. If we notice that a recon is getting stuck, we can take a look at maybe extension attributes that are getting stuck. Extension attributes, while they're running, are stored in library, application support, Jamf temp. We can then run an ls or a list command on that directory to get the identifiers, as seen in the terminal window. You could then use a cat and then path to identifier to read the extension attribute that may be getting stuck. Another workflow example is using the files and processes payload in a policy. We can call Jamf commands in the files and processes payload in a policy. One thing to note here is that you don't need to use sudo when you're using this files and processes payload. Because this is already being run as Jamf, it's already being run as root. So you can just call Jamf and then the verb you're trying to run. This also allows for daisy chaining policies together. You can see here that I run my Jamf policy -event Firefox. I'm calling the Firefox policy we talked about earlier. I've often used this in the past if I have multiple different scopes I need to deploy something to with different triggers. Maybe I need Firefox to install via self-service for some, but on next check-in for others. What I would then do is create one policy that has the Firefox package using this custom trigger and have my other policies pointing back to that first one and calling it via these files and processes payload. That allows me, when Firefox updates, to just have one single payload that I have to update the package in, instead of going into every Firefox policy and updating them individually. So you can use this to daisy chain them together or call additional commands, anything through that payload. The last workflow I want to talk through today is use of Jamf commands in scripts. So we can call the Jamf binary commands inside of scripts. One example of that is if you've used the dep notify starter script. We can see in the script we're calling a few commands with the Jamf binary variable. That variable is defined earlier in the script to be the full path to the Jamf binary. We're then calling verbs like set computer name and using the registration window in dep notify to set the computer name and host name of the computer. Similarly, we're using the recon with the -asset tag flag and pulling the asset tag information also from the registration info and submitting that to Jamf Pro. So this is just showing you that Some scripts you may already be using in your environment are going to be utilizing functionalities built into the binary that we've talked about. Hopefully, you may find other things in your environment that are using those, or ways that you might be able to use this in the future and integrate some of these into your workflows. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. I appreciate your time.